the next speaker. Clara. Clara is not only a great CTI analyst working for the CCB, but also a mountaineer and a professional tourist wherever she goes. If you want to get some traveler's advice and some cool places to visit that are for once unrelated to cybersecurity, she's your go-to person. She always lightens up our office with her always on big smile, and she's also a great speaker, as you will see here in her next presentation. As a CTI analyst at the CCB Citrus, she will give you an overview of what we've observed in 2025, focusing on the last quarter and giving some insights for you to better prepare for these threats in 2026. Welcome on stage, Clara. I hope you're having such a good day as I am.
Thank you, Kevin. By the way, if anybody has ideas about where I can go on holidays, I will also take it. You might not need to put this as a element in the Q&A section of the chat, but I'd be happy to hear any of your suggestions. That being said, thanks, Kevin, for introducing me. And it's really fun to be back on the QCTR. It's been some time, so really happy to be back over here. Of course, some of you might just be wondering, why is it exactly that I decided to call it See You on the Other Side and put a lion on the slide? It's a good question. What you can see is a lion that is possibly hunting. At least the lion is surveying the landscape. And in order to see what's happening out there in the savannah, he needs to be able to rise above the high grass to see. And I thought this was quite telling because for us humans, it can be sometimes complicated to look beyond what's immediately in front of us. We'll easily lost in a day-to-day operational tasks, and that can be sometimes a little bit daunting. So what I suggest is that the QCTR is a really important element because it forces us to rise above, to take a step back, look at what happened in the past months and year, and then take that as an opportunity to let us reflect over what could be happening out there. So I'm going to sound like a yoga instructor, but I should all let our lines out and try to take a look together at what happened in order to see what we think might be happening in 2026. So to get us really fully started, I suggest that we start looking at some numbers. So if you look at the numbers, you would see that in the graph, you have the total number of cyber incident notifications that were filled and reported to the CC over the course of 2025. And you will see there's been a rise in the number from quarter to quarter. If we focus on the last quarter of 2025, you see that we reached 170 notifications. Out of those, 21 are IT incidents that did not have a cyber component. So if you really want to zero in on the cyber elements, we actually had 149. Overall, if you're looking at the total number in the space of a year, you would see that there is a 70% increase in 2025 in comparison to 2024. And that's quite telling because for those of you who've been watching QCTRs in the past, I'm going to do a little throwback moment. If you remember, right, I think it was the first QCTR after the entry into force of NIS2. And there we had already seen an increase in, I think, 58% in the number of notifications.
Hi, Clara. I'm sorry to stop you there, but there seems to be a strange beep every once and again when you talk. I don't know exactly what it is, but maybe you can switch microphones or something.
Okay, I'm going to try to do that. That is interesting. I do not hear it at all. Right, let me try to change it into a different microphone because I am ready for these kinds of issues. Okay, so they should be working right now.
Yes.
Perfect. Awesome.
Go ahead. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you for telling me because I had no idea. All right, so trying to disentangle all the things over there. All right, so focusing on that throwback moment I was telling you about. So it happened that last year when we started looking at this increase in the number of notifications, we did wonder whether everything was a NIS2 effect or not. And of course, in good CTI analyst fashion, we said, we don't know. We don't have enough data to be able to properly make an assessment. Now we're close to a year later and we have a lot more data. And what we assume is that based on the information that we have, this is not all linked to a regulatory element. So we identified 4 reasons why there's been an increase in the number of notifications. Of course, one of the reasons might be just Belgium more targeted, but I think there's a little bit more than that. The first element is an increase in digital activity. So we have more of our lives is happening online. We have a greater reliance on digital infrastructure. And of course, we also have more and more connected devices. A second element, there you have it, regulation. Regulations such as NIS2 and DORA do have an important effect because they, at the same time, broaden the scope of the number of entities who have to report, but they also enforce much stricter incident disclosure obligations. So this sort of works out in 2 ways. The third element is a positive element, I guess. The CCB invested heavily into detection capabilities. And so, of course, as we're sending out more alerts, we also have more incidents coming back to us, or at least organizations who did not know they were compromised are coming back to us and say, actually, they are. And then the final element, and personally something that I was a little bit surprised about, is awareness. When we look at the numbers, around half of the number of incident notifications that we receive come from organizations who are not NIS2 or DORA organizations. So you see just all these organizations who just willfully, voluntarily report that to us. So thank you to them. And also a big thank you to our contact center, because they're handling every single one of those notifications and calling back all of these organizations. And without them, we would not be able to do half of the work that we're doing. And a final element is when we're looking at who actually reports to us, we do see that the most targeted organizations tend to be from the public administration sector. And they're followed by transportation, energy, and healthcare. These are just the top ones, but really we do see incidents from every sector. What we do think is interesting there is that there seems to be an interest in targeting critical services, or at least in companies who have a potential impact on real world disruption. But that is not something that is specific to Belgium. That is a trend that is also observable throughout Europe. Now, if we wanted to really look at what's happening in Q4 in particular, we saw that out of those 170 notifications, the top cyber risks are operational disruption and data theft. And these 2 risks materialize into different kinds of incident types. And the bigger one that we see is account compromise, and that is this dark blue slice over there. I do realize that it's very small on the screen, so you can download the slides and then you can see all of the exact numbers. The second one that we do see as a top incident in Q4 was ransomware, and that is that light blue slice. And the third one was phishing. But if you compare this with the whole numbers for 2025, you would see that there was a little bit of a change, but there was over a lot of continuity, where DDoS attacks was by volume the third biggest attack incident type, but it intensifies with spear phishing. So if we're taking those 3 big categories, I want to talk a little bit by focusing on account compromise. Why is that? Because it is really a category that we started seeing after NIS2 started entering into force. It's interesting because it wasn't that it didn't exist before, it just wasn't reported as much. We just think that organizations didn't see it as worth reporting to the CCB, and now they do. And that's great because we do see a little bit more what is happening out there in terms of potential waves and attacks. What we do see with account compromise is that it is very strongly linked to phishing and social engineering. And that AI, we're starting to see an impact there, also has an effect, which is to improve the quality and the credibility of the lures. So that tends to make account compromise, phishing, and social engineering related threats overall a lot more effective while still remaining cheap. And that's really important because account compromise is what we could call an access vector for other kinds of attacks. It is an enabler. The second element is ransomware as the second biggest incident type. Ransomware, like 2025 throughout, and also like in 2024, is what we would call a persistent threat. So it is a threat that is there all the time, that targets all types of Belgian sectors and all sizes of Belgian companies. We do see some monthly fluctuations, but overall, it's a risk that's always there. When we look at the ransomware cases that we were able to collect information about, we do see that there is a mix of established ransomware groups that are targeting Belgium, but also some more recent emerging groups also being active. One short element that is really interesting there is that if ransomware remains what we call this persistent threat, we do see that extortion tactics are evolving, and they tend to be evolving in ways to add additional pressure into organizations to force them to pay. Just to give you an example, we had cloud ransomware that now shifted to quadruple extortion tactics just to try to keep making money out of encryption. And then another relevant element for 2025 was the fact that we have more and more hybrid actors. So what we saw is that we have hacktivist groups who typically were performing DDoS and web defacement, and they started turning to ransomware as a way to cause more disruption. And that together with the ransomware as a service and with AI, that basically allows less technical actors to enter the ransomware ecosystem. And if we're focusing lastly on DDoS attacks, where ransomware is more of a persistent threat, DDoS attacks are more what we would call periodic threats, because they're still in Belgium very much linked to geopolitics. What we do see is that very often they are carried out in waves by so-called, usually pro-Russian hacktivist groups. And these waves basically are like campaigns. And what they do is it happens at this very specific time that tends to mirror a geopolitical issue. So we had 5 campaigns from the DDoS project in 2025. 2 of those took place in November and December of last year. And just to give you an example of what might be the geopolitical tensions causing these kinds of waves, in December, if you remember, there was all this discussion happening at the EU about using frozen Russian assets that were held by Euroclear. And that typically would have been a reason to start up a campaign. In terms of impact, we do see that impacts are fairly limited, but also varied. So there is no long-term outage that was really observed in Belgium, usually temporary disruptions. And that was mostly for organizations who have limited protective measures and who are also using hosted providers that are outside of Belgium. If we're looking now at how threat actors decided to cause incidents, so we looked at overall numbers and then attack types, let's look at how exactly they got in. One of the primary ways that they caused incidents was by exploiting vulnerabilities. And usually it's about exploiting known vulnerabilities. And I just put a couple of examples on the slide. Why? Simply as a way to get into a system, to compromise a system, but those vulnerabilities are also used in order to expand and develop botnets. And that's something that we sometimes tend to forget about. Another element is malware, which is still very much an element that we should not be overlooking, especially remote access Trojans to remote into a system and info stealer are the kinds of malware that we see extremely often. And that is something that we see not only affecting citizens, but also organizations. And of course, who says ransomware attacks also says ransomware strain. So we were able to identify some malware there. Info stealers tend to be linked to compromised credentials, but it's not the only way. But compromised credentials is also something that when you're not able to exploit a vulnerability, you're still able to get into a system using those. And they're usually pretty cheap. And with password reuse, they can be valuable tools to get into systems. I also talked a little bit about phishing and social engineering in the previous slides. I'm not going to focus too much on that. But in the past quarter and also throughout 2025, we did see the rise of the click fix technique for social engineering. Also related to it, but a little bit less common, file fix. But one thing I would like to slightly put a little bit more focus on is supply chain attacks, because very often we think of supply chain attacks as being the compromise of a supplier. But in these cases, what we've seen very often is poisoning NPM packages that are used by developers. And so there you need to pay a lot of extra attention for the vendors to look not just at how good or bad your suppliers are, but also what is the code that you're going to be running. If we're zooming out to look at the entirety of 2025, we would see once again the prevalence of unpatched vulnerabilities as a way to compromise and breach systems. And that is especially true for edge devices. So vulnerabilities in your edge devices, make sure to patch them quickly. But it's also something that should not be overlooked, that threat actors do also like to look at very common popular technology, including storage technology. Things such as SharePoint can also be extremely valuable for data theft. Another kind of trend that we saw and what was really interesting in Belgium was malvertising as a way to distribute fake software. And so we had a case in the past couple of months in Belgium that was linked to the fake app suite PDF editor. So it's a kind of, it was a Trojanized PDF editor that was just distributed using fake ads. What was interesting there is that we had assumed that it would affect mostly citizens, and we had tens of thousands of hits every day. So we're able to identify a couple of victims. But actually, we saw that a lot of organizations were affected, including large organizations. So there you really want to be asking yourself, what can my normal users do? What can they download? And what can they execute? And I think that's definitely something that we sometimes tend to forget about. And then a third observation that we had was the rise of CEO fraud using messaging platforms. So typical CEO fraud uses a compromised email account, but there we would see that the threat actors would tend to use WhatsApp messages in particular in order to exert extra pressure to force people to pay. Now, if we're looking at state-sponsored activity, and I know that it's one of the sides that people are the most interested about. So in the past quarter, the state-sponsored activity that we saw the most came mainly from Chinese, Russian, and North Korean nexus threat actors. It doesn't mean that there was no activity from Iran. It was just, in comparison, relatively little. We see that their usual goals tend to be intelligence collection and long-term compromise. And if those goals might be shared, the tactics that are used by the groups differ. So the Chinese threat actors tend to try to use their custom malware, such as PlugX, and try to distribute that as a way to get in. Whereas the Russian threat actors would tend to favor a little bit more targeted social engineering, with the idea of getting into the professional environments, especially Microsoft 365 and the Google environments, so trying to get into documentation, but also emails. The North Koreans, on the other hand, just sort of stayed with the remote IT worker scheme, where in Belgium, they tend to focus particularly on organizations who are active in Web3, blockchain, and AI development tools. In 2025, if we're looking at fully the entire year, we see that there is a constant interest in exploited known vulnerabilities as a way to collect intelligence, but also in order to gain a persistent foothold into systems. And that is especially true for individuals and organizations who are active in foreign policy. These ones remain key targets, but what we do see is that there's this trend towards broadening the scope beyond just foreign policy to include other critical sectors. And finally, the use of AI and LLMs is once again playing a role in that it impacts the speed, the sophistication, and the effectiveness of cyber operations. So now we saw all the stuff that happened in 2025. So how does that inform what we think will the threat landscape in Belgium would look like in 2026? Well, we saw that basically there was overall continuity between Q4 2025 with the rest of 2025. And we do not foresee that 2026 will be massively different. We do not expect to see any fundamental shift in the kinds of actors that will be present in Belgium and the kinds of attacks. So we still think that there will be financially motivated actors, hacktivist groups, and state-sponsored actors. And we also think that typically we will continue to see account compromise, ransomware, DDoS attacks, and phishing as the primary types of incidents that will be reported. We also have seen that the Belgian threat landscape mirrors that of other European nations, and we do not foresee that we would become any kind of outlier in that regard. But if the threats don't change, threat actor behavior will evolve. It will revolve in response to multiple things. One is geopolitics, and I'll touch on this in a minute, regulation, of course, but also law enforcement operations, including infrastructure disruption and technological change. And I think that maybe might be the most important element, that AI and LLMs will be extremely important. It will no longer be the norm, it will no longer be the exception, but rather it will become the norm. And that will play out in a variety of ways. AI will be important in automating and also creating malware, in social engineering attacks, et cetera, et cetera. AI and LLM together will boost the scale, the speed, and the efficiency of cyber operations. And so that is a thing that defenders really need to take into consideration. Together with the development of as-a-service models, we assess that AI will also lower the knowledge cost of entry into cybercrime. And so that is why we believe that financially motivated threat actors will remain the primary source of risk in Belgium. If we're looking at now geopolitics as a last element, geopolitics will continue to influence both the targeting priorities, but also the level of cyber activity. And that is true for both hacktivist groups and state-sponsored actors. One trend that we saw in 2025 was a growing interest from hacker groups into operational technology. And that is something that we believe is likely to continue in 2026. And finally, if we're looking at state-sponsored actors, we believe that they will continue to more or less aggressively collect intelligence and try to abuse infrastructure. I know it's a lot of information thrown at you. So first of all, thank you for listening. I'm sorry I'm not able to necessarily take questions at this stage, but please put them in the Q&A section of the chat, and I'll do my best to stay during the break to answer every single one of them.
Thank you very much, Clara. And well, thank you for the overview that we've once more gotten from you. As I got a message from a friend, nothing new under the sun, but still very interesting that we see these things that keep evolving, that keep going into the same direction. So, it kind of gives us time as defenders to keep on working on the same defenses.
That's true.
As many of us still have a big job to do. So think about Cyfun, Cyber Fundamentals, think about your program, and keep on building your resilience. Thank you very much, Clara, and I'm sure you will answer the questions later on.